Welcome to Design As, a show that's intended to speculate on the future of design from a range of different perspectives. This season, we're going to focus on three key words as prompts: culture, citizenship, and for today, we'll focus on complexity. We're going to interrogate and problematize design's new role in the world. And I think, honestly, if you think about it, we've been asking for a seat at the table for a long time as designers. And maybe you could argue in the last couple of decades, we've kind of got it, right? The question is, what do we do now? Design As is brought to you by MasterCard, a global technology company in the payments industry. Their mission is to connect and power an inclusive digital economy that benefits everyone, everywhere, by making transactions simple, safe, smart, and accessible. To learn more about opportunities within their thriving design community, go to careers.mastercard.com and search for design jobs. This is part one of a two-part conversation about complexity. I'm Lee Moreau, the founding director of Other Tomorrows, a design and innovation studio based in Boston, and a professor of practice and design at Northeastern University. Also, our dedicated Design Observer listeners might also recognize my voice as the host of The Futures Archive, which is a podcast from Design Observer that looks at the history of human-centered design with a critical eye towards its future. With me in conversation today is Jamer Hunt. Hi, Jamer.
Hi, Lee. Thanks for the invitation to be around your table.
Thanks for being here. Jamer is the founding director of the graduate program in transdisciplinary design at Parsons School of Design. From 2016 to 2021, he served as the vice provost for transdisciplinary initiatives at the new school. And he's the author of Not to Scale: How the Small Becomes Large, the Large Becomes Unthinkable, and the Unthinkable Becomes Possible. A book that repositions scale as a practice-based framework for navigating social change in complex systems. Next to him, virtually on my Zoom screen here, is Ellen McGirt. Hi, Ellen.
Hey, Lee. It's great to be with you.
Thank you for being here. Ellen's an award-winning business journalist. She established the Inclusive Leadership Beat at Fortune in 2016 with Race Ahead, a newsletter on race, culture, and business. Her great love remains long-form feature writing. The Fortune, Time, Money, and Fast Company alumna has published more than 20 cover stories across her 20-year career. She's currently a contributing editor at Design Observer, where she co-hosted the Design of Business, the Business of Design podcast for 3 seasons. And to complete our roundtable here is Manuel Lima calling in from Portugal. Hi, Manuel.
Hi, Lee. Thanks for having me.
Manuel is a fellow at the Royal Society of Arts and currently global head of design at Interos, prior to which Manuel held positions including head of Google Cloud Data Visualization and senior UX design manager at Google, design director at Code Academy, and senior UX design lead at Microsoft. He's the author of many books covering information visualization and visual culture. His latest book is The New Designer: Rejecting Myths, Embracing Change. Welcome, everyone.
Good morning, Lee. It's great to see you again. Thanks for the invite.
Hey, Lee. How you doing?
It's a pleasure. It really is.
Where this conversation starts, I think, to some degree, is that complexity has seemed like the final frontier for design in many ways, and maybe the final frontier for everything. We've known for a long time that combining systems thinking and design was ultimately the way forward. There were indications that that's where things needed to go. If you look at post-war thought, including cybernetics, different ways of framing the world, there was a sort of convergence toward complexity and the importance of understanding and grappling with it. But we really struggle to have the tools for dealing with this. And sometimes it seems like we're just flying blind. So I want to throw that out there as how does that depiction of where we are feel to you as sort of a starting place for the conversation? Is complexity the obvious thing that we need to be dealing with design? And Manuel, I'm going to direct this at you to some degree, because I think your new book, The New Designer, is almost framed as a designer's guide to managing complexity.
I think absolutely. And I go back to actually my very first book called Visual Complexity. So right on theme. And, in that book, I actually mentioned the work of Warren Weaver, which is this American scientist that divided sort of like the recent scientific endeavors into sort of like 3 stages, right? Covering the century, 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Most scientists, perhaps many designers as well back then, were trying to understand problems of simplicity, right? How one single thing affects the other. Moving towards the beginning of the first half, I would say, of the 20th century, people really understood that there's a lot more variables going on. It's much more complex. But they thought it was fairly chaotic and random, right? What Weaver considers to be problems of disorganized complexity. But then at some point in mid-20th century, we realized that these problems are actually not chaotic, not random at all, right? They actually have a very sort of common pattern to them, which Weaver considers to be problems of organized complexity. It's this seemingly complex thing that actually is quite simple if we look at the sort of the micro scale, because these are very simple interactions just interacting at a really large scale. And nature is abundant of complex systems like that. And a complex system is, by definition, that. It might seem immensely complex, but if you zoom in, it starts with very simple interactions, very simple connections between things, but then it becomes this massively a system that's all interdependent and all interconnected. So I think it's not just a challenge for design. Certainly it is for design, and I appeal for that in the book, in my latest book, that I think the designer of the future needs to be a system thinker at heart. Absolutely. We have to embrace complexity science and really think about systems. And maybe just I would wrap up by a bit of a contentious point, which is we actually use the word system in design quite often, but I think it lacks a tremendous amount of ambition. Because when designers, for the most part, talk about the word system, they mention a UI system, right? Which is like all about the consistency, which is still a valid concern. But I think we need to be much bolder, much more ambitious in our approach to what systems really are, and look at the entire planet as really our canvas, really the system that we should be tackling and embracing.
It's almost framing systems as only an output, but not as an input.
Yes.
It's a little bit convenient, right, for designers to kind of frame the world like that.
It's actually quite simplistic, and I think it lacks a tremendous lack of ambition, which I think it's a problem.
That was really wonderful. And it dovetails with what I've been thinking quite a bit about in my own work and in my own journalism and just in my life, is the moment when complexity becomes personal for the non-designer, for the people who are in the system. The moment when an individual realizes that they're, a node in a data set that is owned by somebody else and benefits somebody else. They make the time and the emotional and intellectual bandwidth to really think through what that means for them. And my example is, I look back at this and I cannot believe it was me. I was one of the first journalists to report inside Facebook after it transitioned away from being a college-only application, which meant I was literally the oldest person on Facebook. Not a single person I knew was using the platform. It was Mark Zuckerberg had just turned 20 years old, and my only friends were Facebook employees, because you can't show up at Facebook at somebody's not having driven their car or used their product, so they're like, fine, we'll be your friend. But as a result, I was the only person, or one of the few journalists, who was presented with a series briefing on the social graph. Now, if I had Jamer and Manuel with me whispering in my ear, I would have navigated that better. I would have asked better questions. I was clearly smart enough to be worried about personal safety. I didn't want to let people know that I wasn't home, that it was not safe, or as a woman traveling alone, I had safety concerns about that. But it took such a series of interrelated and deadly issues related to Facebook's power for people who were not part of the design system of Facebook or not thinking about complexity in this way to understand what they were actually capable of as they became bigger and bigger and they grew. Unchecked harassment, political disinformation, and obviously in places where they were the only access to the internet, bad actors could do terrible, terrible things. So I think a lot about now what it means to have complexity made visible for the average person and what that means generationally, what kinds of decisions people are going to make about participating and sharing their data and sharing their spirit in these bigger systems. But I see the moment as people understand at least what it means to be vulnerable to systems as a huge opportunity for designers with ethics, with empathy, with all the things that I know that you care about, to really think through what does it mean to design with people and with vulnerable communities. So I'm excited about that, even if I contributed early on to people not fully understanding what Facebook could be in the very beginning.
I think Manuel opened a door. I want to crash through it a little bit in the framing of systems and complexity, because I think we have a tendency to really frame this often in technocratic terms, in technological terms, in sort of mechanistic terms. And while that's certainly important, and I think a lot of the challenges that we face in this moment come through those kind of technological systems. I always think in sort of threes when it comes to systems, that we have technological systems, but we also have social systems and we have biological systems. And so we need to recognize that complexity manifests across all of those, as the other guests have talked about. And it's really, we've been dealing with complexity in other kinds of ways for a long, long time. So love and hate are forms of complexity within social systems. And we work through those through literature, through conversation, through family relationships, things like that. And so there's a tendency, I think, sometimes to sort of start thinking about complexity only from, sort of the cybernetic revolution and things like that. And certainly for scientific systems and for systems thinking, a lot started around that time. But I'd really like to kind of open the aperture a little bit wider and just recognize that in many ways, the complexity that we face, we deal with in lots of other ways than technocratic ones. And so something like the kind of, politically generated hatred that now seems to exist rampantly is a problem of social complexity. And yes, of course, there are technological components to it that accelerate it. But I also think that, we have to recognize it as a socially generated condition as much as it is a technologically generated one. If we forget those other biological and social systems and only focus on sort of the technological, I think we miss a huge part of the story and a huge part of the history of how we've dealt with this. In our sort of recency bias, we like to think that every problem is new. And yet I sometimes think that these issues of complexity can be very old. It's just that we don't see them that way because sometimes they don't manifest in, wires and photons and things like that. They manifest in emotions or they manifest in rivers. So I just want to open that door a little bit wider and make sure that we're thinking through complexity in all these different levels, because otherwise I feel like the conversation gets hijacked by the same people who are building these systems that create harm and that they're shaping the conversation and limiting it. They're creating the boundaries for it so that we can't escape their framing of the world that we're building. And I'd like to sort of break down those boundaries.
I like that a lot, Jared, and thanks for bringing that up. Again, going back to the work of Weaver, which I'm a huge fan. It's actually a pretty small paper that he wrote, but I think it touches like so many great points. And when he says that the now and the future, the major challenge we all have is understanding problems of organized complexity. I think it touches both the natural biological systems, like many of the ecosystems that abound our planet, but also a lot of the new technological systems that Ellen mentioned, right? We could talk about those alone for hours. And I think one of the roles that I would love for design to have is really demystifying the notion that things are simple, or like the simple narratives. I think simple narratives can be extremely dangerous, right?
Yes.
So every big problem we have today, from poverty to like climate change to like, you name it, any single big, massive issue is not simple. There's not one single person. It's never black or white. It's a very intricate process going on. And if you change something here, you will not have the end results inside. There's multiple levers, there's multiple factors at play constantly. And we need to understand, I think design has a huge role. And even going back to my previous books and the discipline that I'm so fond of, data visualization, I think data visualization, if I look back at its most grandiose sort of achievement, was really showing these systems that for the most part are invisible. People don't perceive them in a material way, and showing how complex it is.
Right.
And it's not just to scare people off, but it's to demystify this notion of a linear narrative that, hey, if you do this, this is the culprit, a single culprit. Let's go after that person or that institution. There's never one answer for some of these big, massive problems. I go back to this other example of the cod fish industry that was dying off. This was like 2 decades ago in Canada. You can look it up. This is pretty scary stuff. But the government of Canada decided to actually kill thousands and thousands of seals, because seals apparently are the main predator of the codfish, right? Not humans. We don't even consume none of that, but it's the seal, right? So let's go after the seal. And they killed thousands and thousands of these animals. And until a zoologist came up and say, hey, you know what? I'm actually going to let's change the perspective here. And he actually mapped out all 100 species that interact with the codfish. And he came to the conclusion that, yes, the codfish population was decreasing, primarily because of overconsumption on our part, on humans. But it was actually another subspecies that cod was feeding from that was dying for a whole different set of reasons. And this is just another example that even, again, going back to Jamer's point, like we look at nature sometimes even in a very simplistic way, which is a huge mistake because ecosystems are not the simple predator versus prey diagrams that we learned at school that, the rabbit eats the carrot and so on. It's immensely complex. And we need to embrace first that complexity, visualize that complexity, to then affect change in a positive way.
I just want to jump in and say that because of the growth in the seal population now, great white sharks have been coming up the Atlantic seaboard. And I now live in tremendous fear of getting into the ocean because of those seals.
Shark-centered design.
That's complex systems. One thing causes the other.
I used to see one seal like a quarter of a mile out. Now they come by, they parade 15 feet from the shore, right where we're swimming. And of course, the great white sharks come in to trap them there. So yeah, I've got some issues with the whole seal thing.
But Jamer, I think that's very much a part of this conversation because that shark has a social media account, right?
Yes, right.
I mean, that individual shark that somebody saw
is running for Congress. That shark is running for Congress. That shark can get the job done.
It has more Twitter followers than I do.
I mean, that is part of the complexity that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And the problem is, to some degree, one of the problems I would say is that shark with a social media account becomes a big, big story when in fact it's the simple version that Manuel was talking about, right? So we reduce something really complex into a shark with a social media account, and that's a simple thing, but that's not the point. And so I think apprehension or being able to see these systems, we talked about visualization, that is fundamental to this because until we can see these things and really talk about it and describe it, there's nothing we can do about it. So I think part of what design's responsibility is to make things visible so that we can then engage. That sort of apprehension has to precede action.
What is special or what happened to the three of you that helped you get to a place where you could be comfortable living it with complexity, looking at complexity, not having the answer, not knowing the way forward? Is that was sort of the point in the early, when I first started, was there have been moments that I have observed people being willing to sit with the enormity of the systems around them. And that's usually when it becomes personal to them. And that's if you're unusually oriented to showing up for other people, that you're unusually community-oriented, where you can see the ripple effects of simple things impacting other people, and you decide to care about them, and you decide to care about people who are different from you. And that's, Manuela, I was going back to your TED Talk, and I was enjoying it earlier this week, and looking at an org chart, which you presented, which that's the world as a business journalist. I live in the world of org charts, but I was looking at it through new eyes. The average person does not see a role for themselves in an org chart except to do violence to the person who might get into the spot ahead of them. That's it. That's what capitalism does. We live in a world where people don't get paid to not know, to not provide answers, to not provide solutions. But the idea that you three became comfortable with this as a field of study, as a field of inquiry, it settles into your bones as this is the right way to look at the world, these are the conversations we should be having, means to me that you have insights on how to become comfortable with all the things that complexity brings with it, which includes meaning and beauty and death and progress or comfort, whatever that is. Developing a seal-centered design practice, right? I throw it back to you three beautiful people. How can the rest of us living our lives as stakeholders in a broader universe become comfortable with not knowing?
Yes. Ellen, that was a beautiful question. And I think it's really a question that I think we should ask many, many humans, really, because I think at its core, it's human nature. And that's why it's so hard to fight against it. But I really think it's about you learning to become comfortable in the absence of an easy answer. Because guess what? Whenever now I see an easy answer for a problem, like a big problem, I really always take it with a grain of salt because I know it's not that simple. And yes, it's challenging because, again, we as humans, we want an easy answer. We look for answers even when they don't exist. Conspiracy theories happen because of this, because in the absence of information, in the absence of knowledge, we make up something. We need an easy answer always. And as it turns out, a lot of these natural systems and a lot of the new systems we humans are creating, AI, social networks, et cetera, they're not simple. They are immensely challenging to understand. But I think what we have to avoid at the same time, and going back to Lee's point, I think it's our responsibility to make these systems visible, again, to demystify this idea of simplicity. But also, we cannot go to the other side, which is people get easily scared of complexity at the same time. It's like, whoa, this is too much for me. I cannot handle this, right? So there is some sort of like a line that design has to take, a dance, right, between this idea of like demystifying simplicity, but not going completely overboard to a point where people actually get scared. It become numb. We have a challenge, like even in data visualization, which a lot of charts, especially when it comes to human tragedies, for example, people just become numb to charts. It's just another chart, just another statistic. It's just another big number on the screen. How does that matter really to me who's on the other side of the world? So I think this challenge of like invoking empathy, right, and leading to action, I think Lee was mentioning this, is not just about making the system visible, but also like how can you affect change? How can you lead with action that actually could affect something positive, right? So I think that is a huge challenge that I think that we have to face. But again, we have to embrace it. It's absolutely our duty and responsibility.
Yeah, and Ellen, I love that question, and I have a really dull answer to it.
I love dull answers. I love them.
But hopefully I can bring it somewhere more interesting. Because actually, when you ask that, I immediately flash back to the sort of exact time and place where I had sort of an epiphany that I was in graduate school. I was doing a doctoral degree in anthropology, and there was a tension because I was in a very experimental program, and a lot of people wanted to learn kind of the canonical, like the social theory, and they weren't teaching that, and students were kind of upset, and we're doing all this weird stuff instead. And I remember thinking that, everybody wanted to kind of master social theory. They wanted to like have it tucked away somewhere comfortable, and once they knew that, they could kind of move on. And meanwhile, I was reading all this other kind of weird stuff that was much more interesting to me. And I remember in that moment kind of recognizing that there was no way I was ever going to know enough. And there were sort of two options. I could either suffer forever trying to kind of learn enough, or I could adopt sort of the opposite approach, which is you never know enough. You're always sort of floating, drifting in this kind of chaos. And if you could get comfortable with that, and somehow I kind of sensed that that's what the world was like. I think I was too young to know that that's what the world was like, but somehow I sort of sensed that the world was that way, that if you could sort of get comfortable with that floating, that might provide a different way of looking at, in this case, knowledge, which I was trying to sort of build in graduate school. And so I really remember that moment. And I don't know why I remember it, except that it has been absolutely one of the most significant insights that I took away from my entire education, I think. And its implications for me are really radical. Not that I live up to those implications, but just to even think about sort of my practice in the classroom and what teaching is. And so if you step into the classroom with the idea that no one really has any greater understanding of the world than anybody else, and that we're in this together exploring whatever the topic of the class is, and that the teacher's role is not to know more and impart that knowledge, but is to provide a sort of rich learning environment, well, then it really changes what you do in the classroom. Or at least for me, it's really changed what I do in the classroom, because it's also revealed the power inequities within the classroom, the ways in which authority gets built, all of these things that kind of stem from a different way of approaching knowledge or the world, which is like, I know enough, I know more than you. But when you are simply kind of both mesmerized and unsure of the world, it really provides a different way of approaching what learning can be. And so that kind of insight for me was really critically important, because I think it's, I've written essays on, the unknown unknowns. Like this thread has continued throughout my life, and including now, it's precisely because I've found that all the systems, all the organizations around me want to resist not knowing. and they want to know, and they want to claim an authority, a position, certainty, etc. And I just don't get it. I've lost the thread on the idea that you can kind of, know more than someone else or understand something better than someone else. And I'm much more interested in how you and I relate. And I'm going to learn more from that than who has more book knowledge or whatever it might be. So in really interesting ways, I think, and I'm not exactly sure how that all ties to complexity, but I think it's just a really interesting opening. And I want to know for you, when you sort of first saw this, or when, did you have kind of a moment that you really started to realize that, because it felt to me like almost like a paradigm shift, just like a whole new way of seeing the world. And I wondered for you, kind of, if you had a moment like that.
Yeah, that was a beautiful answer. It was a joyful answer, and it made me think of a lot of things. Just listeners, I just want you to know that I'm here with 3 very handsome men bursting with health, all of those kinds of privileges that come with, getting access to, the Googles and the Parsons of the world and, all of those good things. And I come to this as a person who was born in a different body. I'm a Black woman, and I've sort of been wandering around the world just trying to get in a lot of places. And to your point, Jamer, I brought a lot of, when I was younger, after college, I brought a lot of unnecessary bravado and certainty to every interaction I had. And I struggled, I cringe when I look back at how defensive I often felt, or how I needed to seem like I was the expert because I was concerned about all of the trappings of privilege and power that I was just never going to be able to embody. And I was wrong, so profoundly wrong, like 3 times in a row. I'll give you just one example. I had been a writer for a while, and I was, doing all these other things, and I was working for a offshoot of AOL, which was then a big deal thing to have on your resume. And a woman called me up and was like, "Oh, yeah, you're awesome." And it's like, "We are developing a new business, and we're wondering, we're getting people to put in their hat in the ring for it to run this business. It's going to be a multi-million-dollar line of business, slightly different from what you do." I said, "Oh, tell me all about it." I mean, this is like, she had a beeper. Like, that's like the era of technology that we were working in. And she said, "Ellen, it's a new thing. There's a website that's relatively new called Match, and it helps people, find dates and love online." And I, as the higher power of your choice is my judge, I leaned over at that lunch. I may have even put my hand on her arm, and I said, "Honey, no one is going to be looking for love online. Like, there's no one." Looking back, I turned out to be so profoundly wrong, and it was about 3 other things in a row that way. And that was the moment when I said, "Okay, I am bringing a level of certainty to the world that I have not earned, and that is not true. And instead of saying, 'No, that's not going to work,' or 'You don't know what you're doing,' I'm going to say, 'Yes, tell me more.'" Mm-hmm. And that decision changed my life. It got me into some, avenues that's great for me. But it changed my life as a journalist. It helped me be a better writer. It helped me be a better human and community member, because I was actually listening to people differently once I dropped that veneer. So I wish I'd had it earlier in my life, but once I got there, learning to say, "Yes, tell me more," or "Thank you for sharing your perspective with me," just really changed my life.
Hi, I'm Cindy Chastain, Senior Vice President of Customer Experience and Design at MasterCard. And I'd like to introduce you to some design leaders from our growing community.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Halfcost, and I'm the VP of Experience Research and Insights at MasterCard. So I actually came into MasterCard as a product experience designer. The name has changed since when I first joined. And so design was really in its infancy when I joined the company. And I've seen incredible transformation since I became part of the CX&D team back in 2015. So my team, we're all part of customer experience and design. So we're a consolidated capability, if you will. So our collaboration is very natural in the sense that we all come from CX&D and that strong perspective of customer first, the voice of the customer and all of those things. The design community at MasterCard is a mature community, but also still growing. There is room for growth. We're not established in cement, I guess is one way to say it. Since I've been at MasterCard, the design discipline and CX&D has grown exponentially, has made a profound impact on the development of products and services. And I think we're still growing. So it's a great place for somebody to come and be able to share their ideas as well.
From new digital payment products to innovations that empower people and create a more inclusive economy, our growing design community is working to accelerate the future of commerce through experience and innovation. Find out more at careers.mastercard.com and search for design jobs.
I think this brings up the topic of who's included in some of these conversations. So, I think complexity, because it's a little scary, it's a little paralyzing. Maybe when you think about complexity, just in abstract, it becomes a bit of a walled garden, right? So there's certain audiences, academics, politicians, et cetera, people with power and privilege tend to manage or own those conversations, and they exclude other folks from those dialogues, right? Including ones about design. So, and I think this goes back to the sort of design for versus design with conversation. But, this is actually bigger than that. Like, who's having these conversations? So I guess where I'm going with, I think there's a certain level of permission that one needs to have to really have a credible conversation about complexity. That's how it seems in the media landscape, right? And I think also because it's a little scary, which is why I think somebody brought up conspiracy theories earlier, right? So why you have people coming up with crackpot theories, because you're not included in the conversation. So you want to have your own conversation on the side, right? So there's large media, small media. I don't know. I'm just kind of trying to unpack this.
I go back to what Jamie was saying, and Jamie, you're pointing out, asking, how does your story relate to complexity? And I think it relates perfectly, and yours and Ellen's story, right? Because it's all about humbleness. So when you become humble enough that you don't have all the answers, and you will never have all the answers, I think that's a pivotal moment to really embrace complexity, because otherwise you simply cannot, right? But as we know, the world is filled with people that don't care about how dumb they are. They just go full on, right? And I love this imposter syndrome. Everyone, of course, knows what imposter syndrome is, but most of the people that actually suffer from imposter syndrome tend to be more talented and qualified and skilled people. The ones that are not as skilled and qualified and talented, they never suffer from it, because right. they know all the answers, they have it all, and it has worked for them until now, and they become rich by doing what they do best and whatnot. So they think they have all the answers, they think they know it all, and I think that's a recipe for disaster. But unfortunately, again, like who gets the call, who gets the attention, who gets the say, as we know, those are likely the people that will actually have the power to actually make a lot of the decisions, or at least have the visibility to say whatever they want to say. And that's very unfortunate. And I think people that have that sort of humbleness to them, I think those people tend to be cautious. And this is actually, you see this in the scientific community. The whole idea of like climate change. How do we address climate change? How do we communicate climate change? And the scientific community, because again, they are one of those communities that are very careful about what they say, because they know they don't have all the answers, right? They are in a constant process of investigation. They are very cautious. They cannot say it's black or white, even though the public wants to hear black or white, even though the public wants to hear like a culprit or one single decision. They know it's not as simple. So in the process, right, by trying to communicate, it becomes a bit convoluted, and people don't really know what it is, but which is a challenge of communication itself. But what I mean to say is that people that are extremely humble sometimes have a hard time also articulating, what it is that's happening. And I think we are suffering from this, in the whole climate change catastrophe, because I don't think the scientific community is expressing it in the way that they maybe could.
Ellen, you're a journalist.
Yeah, that's where you need a humble journalist to
Right.
help. And it's really hard. I worry about this a lot. The business model of modern journalism does not lend itself to people just spending time trying to understand something. And I, as a long-form writer, I used to have it not that long ago, where I could walk into a company or a system or, supply chain. Manuel, it must have driven you nuts during COVID that everyone's a supply chain expert all of a sudden. But, to actually become an expert requires the patience and goodwill of the actual experts, creating a foundation of trust where I can ask questions over and over again and check my understanding so that you know that I'm faithfully recreating in my own voice, in my own words, what you're doing and why it's important, with skepticism, with a critical lens to an audience that needs to know in a way that they can absorb. And of course, language is linear. It doesn't really help us fully get there, but it's so important. But Lee, your question too is, who's not allowed to talk about complexity? That gets into a question of power in my mind. Speaking in the U.S. and the endless conversations about, welfare and families, we've gotten into such a awful universe on this. But, right somewhere in the U.S., there is a Black mother working very hard, single mom, and she's got SNAP benefits on a card and she's, if anybody was willing to take her feedback about what her real life was like and what it was like to navigate the benefit system and the Medicaid system and and she lives in a state that requires her to work certain hours, all of these things, which changes day to day, she's not considered a person. The welfare queen framing hangs over her. And we all have many, many examples of vulnerable people who are interacting with systems that are designed around us that we could tell that same story. What does it mean to take her feedback seriously? What does it mean to design with her actual needs in mind? And what does it mean to not, this is something that I've really learned in my reporting more recently for Design Observer, what does it mean to, I'm doing rabbit ears, listeners, hide behind jargon that other people are not easily able to understand to keep your position of power?
So much of that.
Yeah. And that's you went exactly where I was going to go, Ellen, in the sense that, power, also expertise, credentialism, the extent to which credentials give you the authority to speak on a topic. And that's, a history of privilege, of power, the exercise of both. And, I think we really have to radically reimagine what expertise is. And so, when we're talking about the ways in which we understand complex systems, you can understand systemic racism by asking a lot of sociologists at universities. And a lot of them are brilliant. A lot of them are my colleagues. And a lot of them are not brilliant. And a lot of them don't know how to, put their pants on in the morning. And yet, who better to answer or to think through what systemic racism is than, the working mother that Ellen was just describing, who understands those systems not only intellectually, certainly that's one frame, but also in her body, in her soul. It's a much more complex understanding of complexity. But, it's a much different understanding of complexity than simply being able to talk through a very narrow range of kind of intellectual concepts, which is how most academics work, how most experts work. And so I think we have to really toss out that notion of expertise because it's built upon a sort of false set of assumptions about how one understands the world. And it's through sort of book learning and getting credentials and peer review and all of the stuff that universities create. I'm in a university. I believe in what we're doing in a lot of ways, but I also am very critical and skeptical about in the ways in which knowledge gets weaponized. And there's no way in which I can think through complexity. I love your question, Lee, because there's no way I can think through that and not also think back to sort of the 19th century and the ways in which science was trying to sort of overpower nature through its understanding of nature and create dominion over nature. And in so many ways, I think of complexity as just also a next order of that. It's like, well, we understand relatively simple mechanical systems. Now we want to understand the really complex ones like the weather so we can geoengineer it. And we can, shoot particles up into clouds so we can change the weather, and all these crackpot ideas that we've been living through for centuries and we continue to live through, we've got to sort of change that equation somehow or another.
Can I just go back to what Ellen was pointing about the working mom? I think that's such a great example. And I think it's also like a little bit of a wake-up call for the design community. And I'm super happy that both of you, both Ellen and Jammer, don't have a background in design because I think design can be extremely snobbish at times and extremely arrogant. And this idea of designing from an ivory tower has to end because, this notion of decolonizing design, I think it's absolutely spot on because I like to say that I'm a designer that hates design books, going back to Jammer's point about being interested in so many other disciplines, I always felt this way from a very, even though, yes, I did study design, I'm interested in so many other areas of life, as most of you are, I'm sure. So this idea that, being in an echo chamber, being part of a monoculture is the most scary thing for me. Absolutely. I think that there's so much evil that can come out of that. But also like designing in this ivory tower, designing in this, being out of touch with reality, with a working mom, right? And you see this all the times. I've witnessed this, right? I've been in design teams that are far from having the diversity that they should have. And yet here we are, a group of very look-alike individuals creating tools that are used by millions and, if not at times, billions of people, right? So the influence that they have, it's tremendous, right? So I think that is something that does scare me quite a lot, this idea of arrogance and of just design being a little bit lost in its way. So I think that should be resolved at some point, I hope.
But first, I'd like to just hold space for all the dopey sociologists out there who do not work with Jamer, are not associated with Parsons or any university or institution that he's associated with, and I hope that they find their way home soon.
Thank you. They might.
A little public service announcement from Ellen. Thank you.
So I'm taking notes here. I want to solve the shark problem for Jamer.
The sociologist's pants problem.
Yeah. Oh my God, these people. I my heart breaks for them.
Join us next time for the second part of our conversation on complexity.
This is happening. It's not your fault, but it is your job. And your job is to notice who is not in the room, not on your team, not in the forest, not represented, and then just ask why.
Every industry now has embraced this concept of futures, and I was sort of curious about that. And it felt like it was, at one level, just the normal sort of way in which concepts go viral in industry. But at another level, it felt like a weird evasion of the present.
I think while maybe the goal shouldn't be to have a seat at the table, I think we're either there or we're close, and we better be smart about the way that we use that seat at the table.
It's not about being the top-down, control and power. It's really about the bottom-up approach. I think it's all of us individually having that responsibility, to Alan's point, asking the why question.
Design As is a podcast from Design Observer. To keep up with the show, go to designobserver.com/designaz or subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you liked what you heard today, please make sure to rate and review us and share it with your friends. You can follow Design Observer on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Design Observer. Design As is brought to you this season by MasterCard. Tune in next week to hear more from Jamer Hunt, Ellen McGirt, and Manuel Lima. You can find more about them in our show notes at designobserver.com/designaz, along with a full transcription of this show. Our producer is Adina Karp. Junie Bell Kamanyan edits the show. Special thanks to CDM Studios in New York, Produção Digital Azul in Portugal, and Maxine Philibong at Northeastern University. Our music is by Joshua Brown. Thanks as always to Design Observer founder Jessica Helfand and to Design Observer executive producer Betsy Vardell.